What's the first great female action lead that comes to your mind? If you asked me this question 20 years ago, it would be Ripley from Alien and Aliens, Sarah Connor from Terminator 1 and 2, and Uma Thurman's bride character from Kill Bill, which my dad actually took me to watch when I was like 7. And San from Princess Mononoke. I flip-flopped on adding Major Motoko Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell, but we'll come back to that later in the video. Now if you ask me today, the great ones that come to mind are Vi and Jinx from Arcane, and Charlize Theron's Furiosa. They shouldn't have named that movie Mad Max. And Underworld was cool though, even if they did kinda rip off Vampire the Masquerade. If there was a graph for this, it would be like character writing drops and the tightness of the leather increased. It's clear that our cultures still have issues with writing great female characters, whether it be Hollywood, Bollywood or Mollywood. But is it just a matter of writing a bad character? Like when someone writes a bad male character, are they bad for the same reasons? I think it might involve something more cerebral and basic, combined with conditioning. Let's take a step back and look at how Hollywood studios have operated for a long time. Dave Farland, the mentor of one of the greatest fantasy authors currently living, Brandon Sanderson, and mentor of Stephanie Meyer, who wrote the Twilight Saga, mentions in his book The $1 Million Outline about his realization that the movie studios have been a boys' club for a very long time, and that even when you look at the highest grossing films for a long time, they tend to be male-led films. However, he does note that there may just not be enough female-led films in general. Now, I'm no insider, but I'm willing to bet that studio executives don't always know everything. They're human too, so naturally they're gonna pick things that resonate with them. And if they grew up with a certain kind of media, that's what will resonate. It's like me playing metal at a house party full of EDM fiends and expecting them to like it. And then when you add money to the mix, and when you make assumptions about what works financially, that's when you get creatives thinking less like artists and more like toy manufacturers. Do this for long enough and that's how you get those cookie cutter films that just become stale over time. But it also sets expectations for the generations experiencing them. But then you have movies like Alien that completely break the norm when they come out. Alan Ladd Jr., who was president of 20th Century Fox in the 70s, famously asked Ridley Scott, "Why can't Ripley be a woman?" That's right, as many of you nerds will know, Ripley was originally written by Ridley Scott as a man, and he gender swapped it at the last minute, and that's how we got Alien. But he agreed to change the character because he thought at the time it would be a fresh take. Lucky for him, it worked. It worked really, really well. Who knows if this would have happened though if Alan Ladd wouldn't have been the guy who greenlit Star Wars and built all that rep for himself early on in his career. He may have never become president, and he may have never asked the question, why can't Ripley be a woman? But I suppose that's how fickle and last minute things can be in entertainment. And of course, to further drive home the point that sometimes these things are just decisions made on a whim by a bunch of dudes playing golf or a bunch of corporates in a boardroom, the studio was sure that Alien was gonna be the biggest hit of 1979. So they decided to make a toy line. Why? Because Star Wars is sci-fi, Star Wars did really well, Alien is sci-fi, we should definitely make a toy line for an adult horror movie with lots of gore and violence. Yeah, definitely make a toy line. But Alien still managed to be one of the highest grossing films of 1979. Wanna know what Alien was up against in the same year? Apocalypse Now, Escape from Alcatraz, and Rocky 2. Those are huge hitters. And as we know, Aliens, the sequel, was really good as well. Although it never hit the heights that the original hit, it was still a fun watch. And let's pretend like the other sequels don't really exist. And with Alien being such a big success, a new schema was formed in the minds of prospective writers, agents, and moviegoers. I'm not gonna go super in depth about the science of schemas, but it's how children understand the world around them. They provide shortcuts for our brains and help reduce processing power when dealing with the world around them. And it creates familiarity. When you look at something like a candle, you know it's gonna burn you. You know how hot wax feels. For the same reason, our brains create schemas about people as well, especially people who are different from us. Hypothetically, if you grew up in a tribe without any contact with outsiders, and then you saw someone new, you'd have a certain group of people who'd be highly inquisitive and excited, and you'd have another group of people who'd be highly repulsed. This also applies to art. If you lived among the Greeks in ancient Greece, you'd be quite used to the protagonist of a story being a bisexual man and the story having horrible endings. The Greeks are ancient history, Ron. We're thousands of years removed from that. Of course, we're gonna be super different from that. Well, allow me to present to you a different culture to show you just how quickly culture can shift. If you were a woman who lived in Kerala, India, up until the 20th century, chances are you probably didn't cover your breasts if you were not from the minority community of Syriac Christians or Muslims. In fact, the historian Manu S. Pillai, who's also from Kerala and not much older than I am, mentions how he remembers his own grandmother not wearing upper clothing.
Actually, nobody wore blouses. Men and women usually wore a mund around your waist, and that was it. You'll see a picture of the Queen of Cochin in 1930, and she's sitting gloriously topless, this elderly lady. I have a photograph of my own paternal great-grandmother. She was in her middle-aged, she must have been about 50 or late 40s when she got a blouse for the first time.
If we look at this with today's lens of morality, one might think, oh, how horrible. The horrible patriarchy of India has deprived these women of the right to cover their breasts. But this just wasn't true. And it only becomes controversial when you project our modern sensibilities and biases onto real-world history. The truth was that Kerala was a matrilineal society, with the eldest woman taking care of the finances. The princesses also did not wear upper clothing. Now, this doesn't match the modern linear narrative of everything that came before was worse for women than everything that's coming now. Before the British imposed their Victorian Christian ideas of morality on the region, covering the torso was just not seen as a mark of virtue or modesty for men and women, because all of our indigenous people dressed this way. The art of medieval Kerala and ancient India in general always showed women with bare breasts, and not in a sexual way. The great painter Raja Ravi Varma had to start painting thin veils on his portraits of women to appeal to the more Victorian Christian sensibilities of the British at the time. So with that, new schemas were adopted and people conformed. During the early days of cinema, the world really was a different place. It was a different audience that had different needs. We had large groups of men who had just come back from war, leaving the women to take care of the households. Fast forward to today and we have a completely different landscape.
We're in a war, a shooting war. We've got to fight. And some of us have got to die. I'm not trying to tell you not to be afraid. Fear is normal. But stop worrying about it and about yourselves. Stop making plans. Forget about going home. Consider yourselves already dead.
Famous writer Haruki Murakami was born right after the war and lived in a post-war America-occupied Japan. He recounts how older Japanese writers would call his work too American because of his love for jazz and American TV at the time. But again, that's just a few generations. And with the rise of American movies and TV in the 70s and 80s, over the years, the idea that men had to be some kind of unfeeling, stoic character became an archetype. Different from the sensitive emotionality, the wrath and the lament of gods of ancient texts. Lord Indra is a great example of this from the Rig Veda, who is shown to be a flawed but powerful god. And if we look at the legend of goddess Annapurna as written in the Anadamangal, we can see how Shiva and Parvati of the Hindu tradition are portrayed. Shiva, the destroyer with all his might and power, still falls into despair with the disappearance of Parvati. Parvati disappears after Shiva belittles her role in the universe and questions the importance of the material world, of our world. Without Parvati as the agent of change and energy, Shiva would become detached and distant. Together, they brought fertility and connection to the world. But without Parvati, the lands became barren and Shiva became alone. Upon seeing the difference in the world around him, Shiva realized how bleak things would be without Parvati and had to come to terms with his loss. Upon sensing this, the compassion in Parvati reappeared as Annapurna at Kashi in order to restore life and nourishment to the world. Shiva himself approached Parvati with a bowl, seeking food and forgiveness. The idea that such a god child like Shiva is able to have such human emotion and this quality of reflection is something that we must take note of. He's depicted as having blind spots, and this is not the only story in the traditions that give us this sense of character. This thoughtful, reflective quality, this emotionality is lost in many of the TV shows and films that we see today. Characters feel wooden because writers or studios keep trying to catch a piece of that well-trodden pie while trying to appeal to people's base instincts. But Ron, sex sells. Look at Game of Thrones, let's be real. Yes, sex sells, but what happened in Game of Thrones after season 5? They still had the sex, but the writing took a nosedive, which culminated into what happened in season 8. Now, what happens if you take these incomplete archetypes of unfeeling, macho, manly men and slap boobs on them? Another variation of this trope is the tight leather suit wearing femme fatale assassin that's clearly designed to sexualize the actress, and they almost always end up being the love interest, and purely the love interest by midpoint or the end of the movie, and lose all their agency. When you do that, that's when you get badly written female characters. It's no secret that writers have more ready to go male archetypes than female archetypes. This means writers should look at real life people, women that they know personally, because when we look at the people around us and truly pay attention, that's when many of the preconceived notions and norms tend to slip away, and suddenly everyone starts seeming like exceptions. I believe that that's when you get the magic, especially if your story is character focused. In some stories, characters are less important. According to Orson Scott Card's Mice Quotient, every story focuses on a combination or one of the following factors: milieu, idea, character, or event. Ghost in the Shell is the perfect example of an idea story, and it doesn't really require Motoko to have a deep and relatable character, because the crux of the story really hinges on whether or not AI can be truly conscious, and her inner struggle is centered around how much of her is truly human, because she's a full Borg. The legendary scene on the boat where she's reflecting on whether or not her soul is real or if her memories are implanted is one of the best scenes of the movie. And then there's the fatalistic idea behind why she goes diving. Even though her cyborg body weighs so much she could easily drown if she malfunctions. It's the closest she can get to feeling fear, the closest she can get to feeling human. And the movie is a classic because it explores these deeper themes. But it's not a classic because Motoko is a relatable character. And it still holds up today because we still don't know the answers to these questions. But take away the central theme and the central question or idea of Ghost in the Shell, and then it becomes very easy to have a cookie cutter, leather wearing action girl again. And that's kind of what you see in the mangas of Ghost in the Shell sometimes. But as a whole, Ghost in the Shell is still a masterpiece despite this. And I've probably watched it, I don't know, like 6-7 times maybe. But on the other hand, you take Vi from Arcane and you take away the central plot, then something else happens. Let's just look at episode 1. If you take away the plot, you still have Vi the sister, Vi the daughter, Vi the leader, and Vi the fighter, with an understanding of how she views social classes in the world, and you get a feeling for what she values as a person. You know that she's a proud person. And this wasn't a fluke. Arcane's writers gave this treatment to all the characters, men and women. This is why it's probably the most unanimously loved. I'll come back to Arcane in a bit, but now let's focus on another trope, the damsel in distress. Action Girl Edition. In my previous video, I mentioned how my least favorite part of the movie Pathaan was how Deepika's character seemed incredibly competent at the beginning, but then at the end just regresses into a damsel in distress and loses all her agency. Let's talk about what we know about her character. She loves the people of Pakistan but hates the militaristic government because her dad was tortured by them for speaking out against the government, but still becomes a part of the terror group funding ISI, and she thinks that's gonna make things better for her people? Yeah, it's confusing because they don't spend a lot of time on that. The reason I know this is because there are maybe 2 scenes and a flashback that kind of tell you this. That tell you that this is her motivation and this is why she's in the plot. But we never see anything. I just didn't buy it because she was never shown to actually deal with any of the trauma. She doesn't have a reconciliation arc. She's made to be mostly fan service and eye candy, with 1 or 2 scenes of actual character building. And they were too concerned with her looking pretty and perfect instead of real. She even gets a scene where she kills General Kadir, the man who represents the ideals that she hates. But it's anticlimactic because we just don't care about her. And at the end of the movie, besides her being Shah Rukh Khan's dance buddy, there's no understanding of what actually happened to her ideals or what happened to the people that she was fighting for. For all we know, the power vacuum by assassinating General Kadir probably left a lot of turmoil and her people are probably suffering while she's dancing. I found that Dimple Kapadia's boss woman character was done much better in Pathaan and didn't have any issues with the way she was written at all. Kapadia's character was much more endearing and human. Well, if this trope was so bad, why do we keep doing it? There are a few examples of it being done well, and let's discuss one of them. Let's look at Princess Mononoke, the highest grossing film in Japan in 1997, which held that title until Spirited Away in 2001. What do we know about San or Princess Mononoke? The first time you are introduced to her, the viewer immediately gets a sense of how powerful she is. You know whose side she's on without her having to state it. You know she's not a Disney princess and is willing to use violence if threatened. She wants to drive the humans out of her home and protect the spirits, the animals, and her mother Moro. They are her number one priority. For the most part, she deals with other humans as she would a natural enemy. She'd kill for her kind's survival, even if it meant killing herself for her ideals. And we see this happen. In fact, she never has a monologue where she has to go up and say, I will kill for my ideals and I will protect my family. She never says that. She embodies it. At first, the only characters that she shows any kind of human emotion to are the spirits and the animals, and later Ashitaka, the male lead. We are shown that she will do anything for them, so it's no surprise when she clings to a dying, corrupted god because she believes she can save him while putting herself at risk and getting trapped in the corruption. Ashitaka and San's mother Moro, the wolf god, have to combine their efforts to save her, and at the end of the sequence, although San is safe, they ultimately fail in that scene. In fact, we are shown that the gods can die, and Moro is lost, and even the boar god that was corrupted is also lost. And this loss makes the climax so much more satisfying when San and Ashitaka have to retrieve the forest spirit's head and restore it. Even the giant monster kaiju version of this forest spirit is handled in a way that is not what we're used to. It's not a giant monster that's there to be slain. This represents a more Eastern understanding of depicting gods as a force of nature and not a giant monster to be slain. And after the dust is settled and the flowers bloom, San doesn't magically forget about her ideals. She still hates humans. She doesn't leave her wolf family and spirits behind for Ashitaka. But despite that, she makes it clear to Ashitaka that he is dear to her, and Ashitaka tells her that he will be nearby helping Iron Town rebuild, so they will see each other again. And they have a dance sequence. Okay, Rohan, all these examples are great and all, but how can we fix it? And as artists, how can we avoid these traps? When writing female characters, I believe that we need to go back to using archetypes as just jumping off points or writing cues, rather than making the character fit the archetype and only that archetype. Let's come back to ARCANE and see how the writers handle this problem. If there was an award for the highest number of well-written characters in one show, ARCANE would probably win it. But that's okay, because ARCANE still bagged 9 actual awards at the International Animated Film Festival. And if you haven't watched it or heard of it, you might be wondering, oh, this is another animated film, animated series, who cares? But actually, this animated series overtook Squid Game as Netflix's most in demand in 2021, especially since ARCANE also had 9 episodes like Squid Game. The amount of character development and plot details that they managed to pull off is just ridiculous. There is an efficiency to ARCANE that definitely took a lot of thought and a lot of rewrites to get right, and the hard work really showed in the quality. It even kept the usual let's hate on every female-led thing gang quiet. If you've watched the marketing material, Vi would have seemed like the typical punchy action girl. Jinx would be the manic pixie archetype. Mel would be the manipulative sexy bad girl using her looks just to get what she wants. Savika and so on would be the muscle girls. All basically landmines for writers today. that would have sent wackos on the internet berserk with rage. But because they took the character first approach and gave them real impact and agency in the story by not being defined at all by what gender they were, and they pulled off a range of female characters that were distinct and memorable. And the clever quips and sarcastic remarks were reserved for characters who would naturally say those things. And they didn't try to make some weird political point about gender. It was always about the characters, their wants, their needs, and how their actions impacted the story. And it's absolutely brilliant. Let me know what your favorite and least favorite female leads are, and if you'd like me to do a deep dive on any character specifically. I'd love to know your thoughts, so please comment below and let me know. And whatever it is, I wish you all the best in your craft.